Okay, well, good. Is it evening or afternoon? You can never tell winter or autumn. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for making your way over to the Adam Smith Institute. It's much appreciated. My name is Maxwell Marlowe. I'm the Director of Public Affairs here at the Adam Smith Institute, and I'm absolutely delighted to have George Selgin with me, and we're going to discuss his new book, False Dawn, The New Deal, and the promise of recovery. Note only one of the three R's promised by FDR, the other being relief and reform, but we'll come on to that in a bit. George is going to talk to us for about 20 minutes about his book, what he found, what the lessons are. Then we'll move over to questions, of which I will be chairing. Now, George has a bit of a struggle on his hands, really, because the kind of New Deal was put in place after basically a 13-month implosion of the American economy, followed by 80 months of explosion out of that. So there are lessons to be learned, but I guess, as you make clear in your book, there are many mistakes made and things that we may have to rectify if there's a coming collapse, which, if there are any monetary hawks in here, I think there may be, given the tech bubble size. But we'll come on to that in a bit. Anyway, if you wouldn't mind helping me give a round of applause to George.
Thank you for that kind introduction. I'm very grateful to be here at the Adam Smith Institute again to talk about my book. Speaking of mistakes, I had given a talk prior to coming here up in Edinburgh at a place called the Library of Mistakes, which is really devoted to financial history. And they have a bunch of financial history buffs, and they asked me to speak about my book to them. And I told them that when I went around before taking the trip, telling my friends that a place called the Library of Mistakes had expressed great interest in my latest book. Many of them gave me their condolences. So I hope that you won't think that my book has more mistakes in it than the New Deal did by the time I'm finished with this talk. Now, 20 minutes isn't a much time to summarize a 300-something page work, so I'm just going to have to glide over some of the basic themes and arguments of the book. I'll start by saying what the Great Depression was, very briefly. I know you all have heard of it, but approximately the Depression was the result, and I say approximately with quite intentionally because there were deeper causes, but approximately it was caused by a collapse of spending and investment. And that collapse had various causes. The breakdown of the post-war gold standard was a big part of the collapse. In the United States, things were made that much worse by the fact that the commercial banking system also had a kind of collapse. Thousands of banks failed. We had 30,000 to begin with, but quite a large number failed. And the banking crises, there were several banking crises that culminated in the shutting down of the entire banking system. So the U.S. Depression was especially severe as a result of the fact that the banking system failed. My book asks two questions about the Great Depression that are closely related. The first question it asks is, how did we get out of it? How did we eventually recover? We were among the countries that took longest to recover from the Depression. The only major country that took as long was France, and not coincidentally. The other question I ask is, what role did the New Deal, that is the set of programs implemented by the Roosevelt administration when Roosevelt took office in March 1933, after he took office, what role did that play in the recovery? Now, there are two popular answers to the first question, and they each involve certain implicit, at least, claims regarding the role of the New Deal. One popular view is that the New Deal succeeded in ending the Depression. That is, the Depression ended because New Deal policies helped it to end. They were effective and they worked, and that's that. This explanation suffers from a number of problems, the most obvious being that the New Deal ended in 1938 and the Depression was still raging then and until World War II began in Europe. There were 17.3% of workers who were either unemployed still or in completely unemployed or in emergency work relief programs in 1939. That's a higher rate of unemployment, much higher than we ever experienced during COVID, when we had some of the highest unemployment rates since the Great Depression. So the New Deal didn't solve the problem, and there are good reasons why it didn't solve the problem. Because, well, let's step back a bit. Today, when we think about countercyclical policy, we think about policies that boost spending again, get it back up. Because recessions, not just great recessions, are often involve a collapse of spending. That was certainly true in the Great Recession. It was true in the COVID crisis. And so how do they get aggregate spending up? Well, either fiscal policy or monetary policy, fiscal stimulus or monetary stimulus. The New Deal didn't actually take much advantage of either of those now standard remedies for downturns, despite the common belief that the New Deal was an experiment in Keynesian fiscal policy. This is one of the great myths about New Deal policy during the Great Depression. It wasn't very Keynesian at all. It's true that the government spent more than it had as a percentage of GDP ever. It spent about twice as much as the Hoover administration had spent, but it also taxed a lot more. So the amount of actual deficit spending, which is the sort you need to increase total spending, that is, the government spending has to go up, but you can't have private spending go down even more because you're taxing people. The amount of actual deficit spending and corresponding fiscal stimulus was not actually particularly great. In fact, there were only a couple years when New Deal fiscal stimulus, to call it that, matched the fiscal stimulus in the first 2 years of the Depression in the Hoover administration, 1930-31. Those years saw more fiscal policy, had fiscal policy with greater anti-depression oomph than most of the years in the New Deal. The one exception was the 1936 deficit, which was entirely a result of Congress passing a bonus payments bill, which involved sending checks to a lot of soldiers who had served in the Great War. But that bill was passed over Roosevelt's veto, so it really could hardly be considered a New Deal measure. And by the way, this is actually a standard view. The popular view is, we had this big fiscal experiment, the first time that Keynesian policies were actually put to work, et cetera, et cetera. But economic historians have always known that was, and regular historians, for the most part, have always understood that fiscal policy did not contribute very much to recovery from the Great Depression. Turning to monetary policy, again, the Fed did very, very little. It's true, of course, that under the Roosevelt administration during the first few days, the banking crisis was stabilized. And that, of course, was necessary. You couldn't begin to demand revive until you stopped the rot, which was, at that point, at the beginning of the Roosevelt administration, mainly the rot consisting of the continuing failures of banks and runs on banks. So the Roosevelt administration deserves credit for stabilizing the banking situation, but not that much, because in fact when it came into office, the Roosevelt team had no idea how to address the banking crisis. The plan for addressing the crisis had been worked up by the Hoover administration Treasury team, several members of which stayed on and helped the New Dealers to deal with the crisis using their own plan. One of them even wrote the first draft of the famous fireside chat that Roosevelt delivered while the banks were were closed, explaining how they were going to be reopened. It was actually a Hoover Treasury Team member. So the New Deal can't even get that much credit for stabilizing the banking and monetary system. As for what happened once the banks were reopened, what monetary policy contributed to the recovery of the economy, the answer is monetary policy played hardly any active part. If you look at the Federal Reserve's balance sheet, it does grow during this time. And think in terms of quantitative easing, because interest rates were very low then. You could say they were practically at their zero lower bound. And when that's true, the main mechanism for trying to stimulate the economy using monetary policy has to consist of expansion of the central bank balance sheet and of this quantity of reserves in the system. And we know various theories today of how this can help, despite low interest rates. Anyway, the Federal Reserve, during the New Deal, didn't actively expand its balance sheet at all. There were two main ways it might have. One is by lending more to commercial banks, but if you look at those Federal Reserve lending to commercial banks from 33 to 39, it's flat. It doesn't go up. It's called discounting at that time, but it's the same idea. The other way is open market purchases of securities. That's flat. So neither of those kinds of expansion of monetary stimulus is happening. There is monetary stimulus despite all this. And I should say, by the way, the reason why it's not happening is because nobody in that administration, Mariner Eccles, who becomes the head of the Fed in 1935, is appointed by Roosevelt. So it's not as if there's somebody at the Federal Reserve who's who's preventing the New Dealers from having their way with monetary policy. Not at all. They had their way more than ever as a result of reforms that gave Washington more power at the Fed. And Eccles was Roosevelt's hand-chosen leader of the Fed. It was that they didn't believe in it. They didn't believe in it. They called it inflation, by the way. They called monetary expansion for them was what they called inflation. And they didn't want inflation. They wanted prices to go up, but they didn't want it to happen because of an increase in the money supply of credit. That's absolutely true. So there was monetary stimulus, and it was the only thing that really promoted recovery between 1933 and 1939 when the war started. But the stimulus was a result of gold flowing into the United States. That was the only thing causing the Fed's balance sheet to grow. And except for a brief period following the devaluation of the dollar in 1934, the main reason all that gold was flowing into the United States was fear of a new war in Europe, especially after Hitler became chancellor. So you have the Europeans sending their gold to the U.S. for reasons of security, so that it would not be in danger of being confiscated by the Nazis. And that is the main thing driving recovery. Not only did the New Dealers not cause that kind of monetary stimulus, they didn't like it. The phrase hot money emerged at this time. It was a disparaging way of speaking about all that gold coming in from Europe. And at a certain point in 1937, the New Dealers decided to do something about it. I'll come to that. But it had catastrophic consequences, effectively ending the recovery that the gold had been stimulating up to that time. So the New Deal didn't end the Depression. The alternative theory that you hear, very popular, and more credible in that at least the timing works, is that the World War II spending ended the Depression. And of course, at first it did. That is, once we got involved in the war, and even before because of the rearmament of Europe, American factories got going again, and finally all the people who'd been unemployed are no longer unemployed, they're in the armed services, and so for the period of the war, certainly, we have none of the major symptoms of depression. You don't have, if the factories are working, they're producing bombs and planes and other things than those they produced in the 30s, but they're working again. And not only is there not a problem of unemployment, but they're having to employ people who normally they wouldn't have been part of the labor force, particularly women who now enter the labor force, are encouraged to enter to keep the factories running. But the problem with this explanation, with treating this as a solution to the depression, is simply this. When the war ends, the spending ends. The spending goes up like the hump of a Bactrian camel, and then goes back down again. And in 1946, I mean immediately after the war, total government spending at all levels as a percentage of GDP is hardly higher than it was when the war broke out in Europe in 1939. And so the question is, how does the recovery, why doesn't the economy get depressed again? By this time, there are a lot of Keynesians in the administration by the end of the war. There weren't many early on, and Keynes himself had no influence on New Deal policy to speak of. He tried, but he had none. The Keynesians are absolutely convinced that unless the government ratchets up peacetime spending at a scale to match or come close to the wartime spending, that the economy is going to sink into depression again. They were all predicting a very severe depression unless the government spent more. They were predicting unemployment rates higher even than the highest during the 30s. It didn't happen. Now, whatever prevented it from happening, despite the soldiers coming back from Europe, despite the retrenchment of government spending, that's what ended the Great Depression. So what was it? Approximately, it was an investment boom. Investment, you really need to have investment revived to have a true recovery from a depression. Usually investment is one of the kinds of spending that collapses. And of course, you need to get that back up, because if you just have consumer spending, you're not producing the goods. And eventually, you can't go on that way. Investment had completely crashed. In fact, for the New Deal period and the 2 years of depression under Hoover, two and a half, there's hardly any net investment. In fact, I think it's slightly negative. But as soon as the war ends, just as government spending is coming back down, private investment, which had been moribund, shoots up like a rocket. And the question is why? And that my book explains. Something else happened during the war that was crucial to that revival, post-war revival of private investment. And what it was a change in attitude of government towards business. The New Dealers had been absolutely hostile to business. They were hostile to some extent unintentionally, because they kept experimenting with the economy and kept throwing new policies at them. And the businessmen could not plan. They had no idea what was coming. And you don't invest if you don't know what's coming. But on top of that, there were taxes that were punitive, particularly later in the New Deal, and there was all kinds of anti-business rhetoric, some of which was a result of Roosevelt wanting to steal the thunder of outright socialists and fascists who were threatening to interfere with his election prospects. So businessmen had all kinds of reasons for holding back, for playing wait and see. During the war, everything changed. The government, this is still the New Dealers, is still the Roosevelt administration, but as Roosevelt himself said to a reporter at some point, I'm no longer Dr. New Deal, I'm Dr. Win the War. And winning the war meant getting business to cooperate to produce the planes and munitions and other things needed. And the next thing you know, government forms a very cozy relationship with business. You even have many businessmen coming to Washington to run the many bureaus involved in managing wartime economy. Then the New Dealers themselves find out, in dealing with these businessmen, that they're not so bad after all. Finally, you have the actual success of the American economy at producing the stuff needed to win a war that convinces more and more people that, not only is American capitalism not dead and in need of, artificial support from the government, but it works pretty well. So as a result of all these changes, when the war ends, businessmen have gone from being totally pessimistic, scared, reluctant to invest, to being ready. As soon as the prospect of gaining from investment is realized by the end of the war, and they go at it. And that's the real story of the end of the Depression. I want to say one final thing. I think I've gone a little over 20 minutes.
You're good.
Am I all right? I want to say something about Keynes. I've already said a little bit about him, but to repeat, Keynes had very little influence on the New Deal, despite the mythology that says this was one big Keynesian experiment. Mythology, by the way, that has been swallowed both by the critics of the New Deal, who say, see, this was a Keynesian disaster, and by fans of the New Deal, who said it was a great, successful Keynesian experiment. It was neither of those things, because Roosevelt was never influenced by Keynes. Keynes tried to get Roosevelt to spend more, for one thing, and Roosevelt said, I'm already doing everything you're telling me to do. I don't need your advice. There was no interest on Roosevelt's part. Roosevelt was a fiscal conservative. He spent as much as he did reluctantly. This is often forgotten. For example, the big bill passed during the famous 100 Days that included the National Recovery Administration, which was a disaster we can talk about, also included the Public Works Administration, which is a $3.3 billion spending plan. That was, looked a lot like a Keynesian sort of thing, except Roosevelt wasn't keen on that part of the bill. He supported it because he wanted the National Recovery Administration to be created. And he only reluctantly went along with the Public Works idea, which was mainly being boosted by certain progressives in Congress who had tried it during the Roosevelt administration and now managed to railroad it through on this other piece of legislation. We could talk more about that. But Keynes didn't just have positive advice to Roosevelt about you should be spending more, deficit spending more. He also was extremely critical of the things the Roosevelt administration did consider crucial for recovery. The National Recovery Administration, which is a disastrous price control scheme that prevented any growth in demand from creating as many jobs as it might have. He was critical of Roosevelt's gold policy in a sound way. He said, look, you should have simply devalued instead of futzing around for months with a crazy gold purchase scheme. He was very critical of the anti-business policies of Roosevelt. He said, you need to give businessmen the confidence they need to be willing to invest again. He was quite eloquent on that. He said, you're scaring them. Cut it out. This isn't the time. Scare them later. Let the recovery happen first. So I want to put in a plug for Keynes. I think he gets a bad rap by both sides in most discussions of the New Deal. I think if Keynes's advice, and I say this here at the Adam Smith Institute, knowing that it's a controversial thing to say, but I sincerely mean it. If Keynes's advice had been followed, instead of the advice from the pardon, I'm drunk, I'm speaking of brain, from the brains trust that surrounded Roosevelt, if Keynes had had his way, I think the Depression in the United States would have been over by 1937. I absolutely, very confident in that. Anyway, I'll stop there because I think I've done exactly 20 minutes.
Yeah, that's absolutely fine. Well, it's the only time John Maynard Keynes has been endorsed in these four walls, so I think we'll keep it that way, if that's right. It was really, well, thank you very much, George. It does make me miss reading economic history quite a lot, but that brings me on to my first question. And you've spoken a lot about, deficit spending, spoken a lot about, as you said, fussing around with gold. Do you not think the Fed has more to blame fundamentally, for that great contraction because of the expanse of credit and the amount of money flowing through the system? Is there not more of a structural monetarist argument about this? And do you take that into account much? I mean, what have you got to say to those more Chicago school economic historians?
Well, I'm a little confused by the question. The Chicago people, including Friedman and Schwartz, as far as they're concerned, the Depression would have been avoided if the Fed had not allowed money to tighten at the end of the 1920s. They didn't blame the Depression on any overexpansion on the Fed's part, and this is where they disagree with the Austrians. They believe that the real trouble was the failure of the Fed to continue to create adequate credit to maintain stable prices, and they faulted once the banking system started to collapse for failing to take adequate action to address that collapse, whether by saving banks or by engaging in compensating open market purchases of securities that would allow the money supply to be maintained even as banks failed. All of this is perfectly, I agree with all of that, without, let's say, putting aside the question of whether the 20s were a period of overexpansion. We can talk about that, but otherwise I agree entirely with Friedman and Schwartz that the Fed should have done more. By the way, there was a period during the Depression when the Federal Reserve engaged in some substantial, at least by that period's, according to that period's norms, some very substantial open market purchases to counter the Depression. It was 1932. And the man who pushed hardest for it was Hoover, Herbert Hoover. FDR there was never anything equivalent. You never find anything from FDR saying we need to get the money supply back up. On the contrary. But it wasn't enough. So I don't see any tension between, I don't see any problem with the monetarist interpretation of the proximate problem with Fed policy and how it contributes. But it's quite consistent with my telling you that one of the things that the New Dealers did not do was to take advantage of monetary stimulus, where monetary stimulus includes at least having enough Federal Reserve expansion to keep the money supply from contracting.
Fab. I'm going to put my Bernie Sanders gloves on now. And
this is going to hurt.
The banks, will they never learn? Will capitalism ever learn, fundamentally? And obviously there was, deposit insurance came in, backstops were put in place. We saw a very similar thing in 2023 with the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank. Quite similar, really. So do you think these rescues the government comes in and does, do you think they encourage stability? Or do they just put in the minds of those financiers and those people buying stocks and whatever else that it's okay, you'll go through a bit of harm, but we'll be there to help you? Do you think that's the lesson learned from this?
There are a number of things that were done to stabilize the banking situation in the 30s, and some of them, of course, did contribute ultimately to problems that we see still today, moral hazard. But it's important to recognize that the main problem with the banking system in the 20s and 30s, because the banks had been failing in droves in the 20s already, was not government bailouts, which were not important yet. It was the structure of the banking industry which led to the proliferation of many, many small, under-diversified banks, particularly in rural areas. Many of them were established during World War I, when there was a boom in agriculture in the United States because they weren't farming in Europe, they were fighting. And the American government encouraged investment in agriculture when it entered the war. When the war ended, the boom ended. And that was the beginning of the banking crisis, because many banks in rural areas started to fail. Thousands failed in the 30s. You have to, as a British audience, you're used to having 5 banks total. But we had 30,000 starting out in the 20s. And then it went down, to 20,000, and then it fell lower and lower. And so you had to have thousands of banks fail in the United States before you were really in trouble. But of course, many communities were in trouble because they were one bank, they had one bank only in their community. So the banking crisis starts out as an agricultural crisis and a failure of banks. And the reason banks are entirely bound up, many of them, with agriculture is because they can't branch. Branching of banks was very, very strictly limited in the United States. So most banks had one little office, and that was that. So they couldn't diversify into other regions. They couldn't even be sure they could have branches in towns where the crops were different, let alone have a branch in the city where they could make loans that had nothing to do with crops or livestock. So we had a very weak banking system. In the 30s, after the crash, during the bank holiday when they shut down all the banks, there were people saying, let's reform the banking system and have branch banking. But branch banking had a powerful opponent in Congress named Stegall, he of the Glass-Steagall Act. Glass wanted branch banking. Anyway, as a compromise, there were a number of factors they considered that went into the banking bill of 1933. Deposit insurance was ultimately resorted to as a way to prop up the weak banks that were going to be reopened after the holiday, some of them, not all. And Roosevelt was against it. Roosevelt was against deposit insurance till the 11th hour. He only finally relented because he could see the handwriting on the wall that there was too much support in Congress for that component of the bill. So anyway, the rot that deposit insurance itself introduced into the banking system, which got worse and worse, especially when combined with government guarantees, with bailouts, outright bailouts of individual banks, that wasn't Roosevelt's fault. That was something that he was personally not keen on. Now, deposit insurance, though, was not really the most important factor in stabilizing the banks and helping them reopen after they were all shut down during the bank holiday. The other factors that are often overlooked are, first of all, deposit insurance didn't actually take the FDIC didn't actually get going until January 1934, but there were temporary insurance substitutes in place before that. But a lot of the banks that were shut down by the bank holiday that had been open up until then weren't in trouble in the sense of being insolvent. Many of them were solvent. Most of the insolvent banks had already failed. But what happened in March 1933 that led to the shutting down of the banking system was a run on gold, because people feared that Roosevelt would end up devaluing the dollar. Now, once you decide that the dollar is going to be devalued, you run on your bank, not because you think the bank is insolvent, but because you want to get your Federal Reserve notes from it, and then you can present those for redemption at the Fed. And it was the Federal Reserve Bank of New York that was running out of gold that pleaded for a holiday from the New York State and ultimately supported a holiday for the nation as a whole. So when the banks were reopened, they were reopened after it became illegal for people to take gold, to own gold anymore. It made gold ownership illegal. They took steps to get people to bring the gold that they'd taken out of the banks back. But since people couldn't take gold out anymore, of course, if their banks reopened, they lost that most important reason for running on them. So that was the main reason why the banking system looked more stable after the bank holiday, because the stuff people wanted from their banks they couldn't have anymore. And apart from that, they knew that many of the banks were solvent. There's another myth about the bank holiday, which is Roosevelt says in his fireside chat, well, we've got to have bank inspectors who are going to go to all the banks in the country and figure out which ones are sound or not. We're only going to open the sound ones. Except they couldn't possibly have done it in the 10 days they had at their disposal, or 11 days. In fact, what the inspectors ended up doing was opening a lot of banks right away without having to look into their books, because they knew they were sound. They knew they weren't in trouble, that they'd only had to be closed because of the run on gold. And so they went by there, they looked at the previous reports that were already done by the last inspection, and if those were good, they said, okay, open up again. And they opened and nobody ran because they didn't have gold. So there's a lot more to the reopening the banks than the conventional wisdom that everyone was soothed by Roosevelt's fireside chat. Everyone believed the inspectors would only open sound banks. Everybody knew that their deposits were insured. Those were actually relatively minor factors. The main thing was the bad banks were gone and you couldn't have gold anymore.
The hard rules. Right. I'll finish with a pop question, a bit of an 11th grade question, and then we'll open up to the floor.
I thought you said you asked Bernie Sanders.
Ah, very good, very good, very good. What was your favourite alphabet agency, and what was your least favourite, and why?
Well, my favorite alphabet agency is the HOLC. I give very high marks to the HOLC. That stands for Homeowners Loan Corporation. Now, what this was set up to do was essentially refinance mortgages, residential mortgages. Why was that important? Well, if you're not going to have demand, it's going to boost demand and get it back up again, people can't pay their mortgages, right? Their incomes just don't allow them to pay their mortgages. But it's very hard, it was very hard then for the people to refinance. So that these are long-term contracts. There's just no easy way to for them to renegotiate and have new contracts developed. There are a lot of details as to why that was so, but it took concerted action to get the refinancing accomplished, and the HOLC was set up to do that. They did it very cleverly. They took advantage of implicit and explicit government guarantees to basically approach the owners and the lenders and say, look, they said to the lenders, if you sell us that mortgage, we'll buy it from you, we'll give you a good price, but we're going to buy it by handing you bonds. So the lenders are financing the purchasing, and the creditors then get new loans that are on terms that many of them could afford. And this was very important because it saved a lot of the creditors and it saved a lot of the homeowners. And it ended up not costing much money. And the reason it ended up not costing much money is because of the war, so they were lucky. The real estate money picked up. So if they had to sell the property during the Depression, they would have taken some big losses. So it was a gamble. But it was a very clever gamble, and it really helped a lot of people. And it helped it helped the homeowners, but it was at least as important that the creditors be helped so that they could get back into the lending business again, get back on their feet. That's my favorite.
The least favorite.
My least favorite is most economists' least favorite, the National Recovery Administration, or NRA. This was really, along with the AAA, which we can talk about separately, the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, the National Recovery Administration was the main pillar of the New Dealers' recovery program. They didn't want to expand the money supply. They didn't want to engage in much fiscal stimulus if they could avoid it, that is deficit spending. But they still wanted to get the price level back up. And the NRA was basically an arrangement whereby industries were encouraged to form cartels, and the cartels were asked to come up with sets of regulations that essentially were price and wage codes, controls, that the government would then help enforce by throwing people in jail and fining them if necessary. But these codes weren't like the price controls that we hear about recently, mostly aimed at keeping prices from going up. These were price controls aimed at propping prices up, keeping them from going down, but even propping them up. And of course, if you dictate, if you use codes to raise prices, lo and behold, you get a higher price level. And if you think higher prices end depression, that's a good policy. If you think it matters why they go up, it's not a good policy, because if they're going up because of the codes, you're actually, first of all, you're not giving firms any more resources with which to hire more workers. They're not earning more money. And in fact, if the codes make wage rates go up, other things equal, they end up having to hire fewer worker hours. The shocking statistic that you can find if you look shows that in 1933, when the NRA takes effect, later in the late summer, the unemployment rate is 25% or so. Right? Some of those people are on work relief, but they are counted conventionally as unemployed. And when the NRA takes effect, when the codes take effect, real wage rates shoot up. Now, how do real wage rates shoot up with people clamoring for jobs? They should be bidding them down. That's the NRA codes. The only reason unemployment didn't go up even higher as a result of those codes, and it doesn't, right? And a lot of people say, see, the economy's recovering. The unemployment was actually falling. But what they don't realize is, along with the NRA, there was a work sharing legislation or a requirement. So these firms are all taking jobs that used to be full-time jobs, say 50 hours a week, and they're turning them into 2 or even 3 part-time jobs. So when unemployment is measured by the number of people who are unemployed, which is how we usually measure it, or the percent of the labor force unemployed, it doesn't matter if you're still employed if you're doing 20 hours or 50 hours. So the only reason unemployment didn't go up is because they were splitting available jobs among larger numbers of workers for this period. And the actual labor hours that were hired were fewer because they had to pay total hours hired were fewer. So it was a disastrous thing all around. Almost everybody in the New Deal, not to mention all economists, thought that it was a disaster. The only guy who really didn't want to see the NRA go away was Roosevelt. But finally, the Supreme Court didn't give him any choice. They declared it unconstitutional in May 1935.
There we go. Right, I'm going to open up to questions from the floor now.